Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome to episode 3 of The Plot to Seize the White House, the shocking true story of the fascist conspiracy to overthrow President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This book is by Jules Archer. It's a classic. It was written in 1973, and there's still so much in here that really rings a lot of familiar bells for us here in the year 2025. In the first few chapters, we were sort of laying out for you what all was going on in the world. You know, it was 1932. You had the bonus march of, hundreds of thousands of World War I veterans who were now homeless and jobless during the Great Depression, occupying Washington. They came to D.C. in great numbers and set up camp right there outside the United States Capitol to demand that Congress pay them their bonuses that they were promised for their service. I know that obviously things are not that bad yet in the United States in the year 2025, but I think a lot of us feel a great deal of unease about where this economy is going. Just look at the headlines today. I'm looking at the headlines now. Is the U.S. already in a recession? Financial Times. U.S. economy very close to recession, warns Moody's chief economist. That's in the Washington Post. Edge of the cliff. A top economist says the U.S. is in a full-blown labor recession. And we've seen the jobs numbers these past few months not looking good. Unemployment rates ticking up. We have a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, a homelessness crisis, a perfect storm of all of these things coming together at once. Plus, as the jobs go away, we realize that we humans are being replaced by AI and technology. So what happens to the people? How are the people supposed to survive? All of that added together brings us to a place very much like where things were in some ways in 1932 when the bonus army marched on Washington. And you wonder, could that happen again in America? Would we ever see something like that? It was so extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of jobless, homeless Americans camping out on the streets of D.C., demanding that the government step in and help them. Fortunately for the people in 1932, help was on the way with the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. The New Deal did get people back to work. It did provide a social safety net that we never had before. And that's what makes this book so fascinating to me, is that the opposition to those very ideas, of course, were decried as socialism, communism. But then you peer back behind the curtain, who's doing all the complaining, and it turns out to be the richest oligarchs in America, who obviously are opposed to that. And they were, in fact, trying to overthrow the duly elected president of the United States, who the people sent to Washington to help look after the people's affairs. In the previous episode, Chapter 7, General Smedley Butler is having all these meetings with Jerry Maguire. Jerry Maguire was the bond salesman who was trying to talk General Butler into heading up this new, People's Army. And Smedley Butler was very, very skeptical of this whole scheme, keeps trying to make Maguire prove himself. And Maguire would give him little tidbits of information about a member of the administration about to resign or get fired. And sure enough, within days, it would happen. That's when Smedley Butler realized he wasn't dealing with just some random kook. These people were for real. So we're going to pick it up on page 30, if you're reading along with me, in the hardcover edition of The Plot to Seize the White House, Chapter 8. There were too many things that Maguire had told him that rang true and could not possibly have been invented. Even as General Butler brooded over the affair and wondered what to do about it, another of Maguire's uncannily accurate predictions materialized again 2 weeks after their talk. In September 1934, the press announced the formation of a new organization, the American Liberty League, by discontented captains of industry and finance. They announced their objections as to combat radicalism, to teach the necessity of respect for the rights of persons and property, and generally to foster free private enterprise. Denouncing the New Deal, they attacked Roosevelt for fomenting class hatred by using such terms as unscrupulous money changers, economic royalists, and the privileged princes of these new economic dynasties. General Butler's eyes widened when he read about the treasurer of the American Liberty League, who turned out to be none other than McGuire's own boss, Grayson M.P. Murphy, and one of its financiers was Robert S. Clark. Heading and directing the organization were DuPont and J.P. Morgan and company men. Morgan attorney John W. Davis was a member of the National Executive Committee, the same Davis that Clark had identified as author of the gold standard speech McGuire had tried to get Butler to make to the American Legion Convention in Chicago. Heavy contributors to the American Liberty League included the Pitcairn family, that's Pittsburgh Plate Glass, Andrew W. Mellon Associates, Rockefeller Associates, E.F. Hutton Associates, William S. Knudsen, General Motors, and the Pugh family, Sun Oil, J. Howard Pugh, longtime friend and supporter of Robert Welch, who later founded the John Birch Society, was a very generous patron, along with other members of the Pugh family of extremist right-wing causes. Other directors of the League included former New York Governor Al Smith and John Jacob Raskob. Two organizations affiliated with the League were openly fascist and anti-labor. One was the Sentinels of the Republic, financed chiefly by the Pitcairn family and J. Howard Pugh. Its members labeled the New Deal, quote, Jewish communism, and insisted that the old line of Americans of $1,200 a year want a Hitler. The other was the Southern Committee to Uphold the Constitution, which the conservative Baltimore Sun described as, quote, a hybrid organization financed by Northern money, but playing on the KKK prejudices of the South. Its sponsor, John H. Kirby, collaborated in anti-Semitic drives against the New Deal with the Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith, leader of the first Silver Shirt Squad of American stormtroopers. The brood of anti-New Deal organizations spawned by the Liberty League, the New York Post subsequently charged, quote, are in turn spawning fascism. Butler was stunned by this fulfillment of McGuire's prediction. As he later testified, just at the time McGuire had said it would, the American Liberty League did appear, and it was all that McGuire had said it would be. And it was obviously no coincidence that Grayson M.P. Murphy, Robert S. Clark, and the Morgan interests were deeply involved in it. Even yet another of McGuire's predictions came true just a fortnight later, when Al Smith published a scathing attack on the New Deal in The New Outlook, breaking publicly with the president over economic policies. If General Butler had any lingering doubts about the authenticity of McGuire's claim to have insider knowledge of what American big business leaders were up to, the appearance of the American Liberty League on schedule and Al Smith's break with the White House convinced him that McGuire's revelations about a plot to seize the White House were no crackpot's fantasy. McGuire had called the shots every time. Butler was now genuinely alarmed. For the first time, it dawned upon him that if the American Liberty League was indeed the super organization behind the plot that it seemed to be, the country's freedom was in genuine peril. Such money and power as the men behind the League possessed could easily mobilize a thinly disguised fascist army from the ranks of the jobless, embittered veterans, and do what Mussolini had done in Italy with the financial support of the Italian plutocracy. Getting in touch with Van Zandt, Butler told the VFW commander that he had been approached to lead a coup as a head of a veterans army. He warned that the conspirators intended to try to involve Van Zandt, too, at the VFW convention in Louisville. Thanking him for the warning, Van Zandt assured General Butler that he would have nothing to do with the plotters. Butler was tempted to leave for Washington immediately to warn the president or his advisors. He now knew enough to expose the whole plot. But he was pragmatist enough to realize that on his unsupported word, without the slightest shred of evidence, he was likely to be greeted with polite skepticism, if not ridicule. Heads would shake. Poor Smedley Butler. How sad. A fine, brave Marine general like that, losing touch with reality. Too many campaigns, too many tropical fevers. At best, they might believe that McGuire had indeed told him all these fantastic things. But then McGuire, obviously, had to be some kind of psychotic nut. And Butler would have to be an idiot to have taken him seriously, to have believed that many of the nation's greatest leaders of the business and financial world would get involved in a conspiracy to depose the president and take over the White House. McGuire, of course, would deny everything. So would Robert S. Clark. So would everyone connected with the American Liberty League, if this was, indeed, the superorganization McGuire had revealed was behind the plot. The enemies Butler had made among the military brass during his colorful career would help the press ridicule his revelation. Butler's at it again, stirring up a storm, making headlines, worst publicity hound that ever wore a uniform. But Smedley Butler had never in his life backed off from his duty as he saw it. Convinced that the democracy he cherished was in genuine danger, he steeled himself for the ordeal of public mockery and humiliating attacks that he knew would follow his exposure of this conspiracy. He was enough of an expert tactician, however, to know that he couldn't win his battle without supporting troops. He would need corroborative testimony by someone whose word, when combined with his own, would have to be respected and force a full-scale investigation. General Butler confided in Tom O'Neill, city editor of the Philadelphia Record. Observing that the whole affair smacked of outright treason to him, he asked O'Neill to assign his star reporter to dig into the story. O'Neill agreed, and reporter Paul Comley French, whose news features also appeared in the New York Post, was instructed to seek confirmation of the plot. Butler knew and respected French, who had done an intelligent and honest job of covering his fight against crime and corruption in Philadelphia 10 years earlier. French set about determining whether McGuire and his group were operating some kind of racket to extort money out of the rich by selling them political gold bricks, or whether a cabal of rich men, enraged by the president and his policies, was putting up big money to overthrow FDR. In view of the powerful people the general had named in connection with the plot, French knew that his assignment was a keg of dynamite. Even if he could somehow confirm the existence of the plot and identify the conspirators, he and the general were bound to meet with disbelief when they sought to expose the blueprint for treason and the traitors. Much would depend upon establishing and documenting the credibility of Smedley Butler, the chief witness. If the general's career showed him to be given to gross exaggeration or chronic lying, or to be an officer of dubious character whose word could not be trusted, then his sworn testimony against those he charged with treason would be held as worthless. If, on the other hand, an examination of his life and career proved that he was a man of incorruptible character, integrity, and patriotism, then his testimony would have to be given the gravest consideration, especially when supported and corroborated by the findings of French's investigation. Whatever the outcome, the reporter knew that the denouncement would be a stormy one. To Butler's enemies, he was highly controversial, an unorthodox fighting man whose irrepressible temper and tongue kept him in the headlines. To his friends, he was a patriotic war hero with strong convictions about democracy and a deserved reputation for bluntly speaking out the truth, regardless of consequences. What kind of man, actually, was the Marine general who was accusing many of America's leading financiers and industrialists of seeking him as the indispensable man for their fascist plot to seize the White House? Well, you find out in part 2 of the book called The Indispensable Man. And I am going to be skipping over a lot of this, obviously for copyright reasons. I can't read the whole book in this book club, so I'm choosing selected excerpts carefully. And the next few chapters are really just a good biography of the life of General Smedley Butler. It's really good stuff, and I hope that you will buy the book and read it, or at least read a good biography of General Butler. But I'll give you a few highlights from these chapters as we move along. I'm really just trying to stick to the plot itself. I think those are the juiciest parts of the book here for this book club. I mean, General Butler's storied career just in his military years, from the Spanish-American War to all of the interventions in Latin America and Asia, that's a whole big fat book in itself. Fascinating stuff. And most of those stories, I think, are pretty well known, especially if you've read his own book, War is a Racket. But I think some parts of Butler's life that are lesser known and also ring familiar bells today, right now in 2025, just as we see President Trump now deploying the National Guard to Washington, D.C. and other cities around America to fight crime. A similar scenario unfolded in 1923, but it had more to do with enforcing the federal prohibition laws, and General Butler got roped into that. So I'm going to read you a little excerpt here on page 82. W. Freeland Kendrick, the new mayor of Philadelphia, urged General Butler to take a leave from the Marines to become the city's director of public safety. The job was that of a super cop in charge of the police and the firemen, with the task of smashing the links between organized crime and politics in Philadelphia. Under Prohibition, the city had become one of the most corrupt municipalities in the country. Over 8,000 places sold bootleg liquor without fear of prosecution. Gangsters ran wide-open gambling joints and brothels. Robberies, holdups, and other crimes were soaring. All attempts to clean up the city of brotherly love had failed because of a profitable alliance among gangsters, speakeasy operators, and crooked ward bosses who bribed and controlled the police. Mayor Kendrick, a conservative Republican politician, had been elected mayor on a law and order campaign and was now under heavy pressure to keep his pledge. He was advised to bring in an outsider, preferably a military man who could not be bought, bluffed, or bullied to head the police. Brigadier General Smedley Butler, now a vigorous 42 and a colorful war hero with an impressive list of credits in Who's Who in the services, seemed a perfect choice to please the voters. But General Butler declined the job. On November 21st, as he wrote Kendrick, quote, "While this position would appeal to me very greatly if I believed there was the slightest chance of success, I am convinced that the present political conditions existing would throw away the work of a lifetime in a perfectly hopeless undertaking." But Kendrick and the Republican Party of Pennsylvania now needed him desperately to still a storm of public criticism. So Kendrick, Congressman Bill Vair, and Pennsylvania's 2 senators went to the White House to plead with President Calvin Coolidge that Butler be given a year's leave of absence to clean up Philadelphia. Only a man with Butler's reputation for total honesty and the ability to discipline men while capturing their imagination and winning over their loyalty, they told President Coolidge, could effectively reorganize the Philadelphia police force. The president finally agreed and sent word to Butler that the White House would like him to tackle the job in the interests of good government. His father warned him against it as political quicksand, but Butler did not know how he could refuse a mandate from both the people of Philadelphia and the President of the United States. His reluctant consent brought wondering letters from old comrades all over the world, many of whom imagined that he had resigned from the Marine Corps. Butler assured them that it was only temporary. Quote, "This job is a terrible one, and I will probably be cut to pieces," he wrote to Lieutenant Colonel H.L. Roosevelt in Paris. "On January 7th, I will be sworn in as a Philadelphia cop, for better or worse." In his first week on the job, he raided and shut down 973 liquor and gambling joints without even warning Mayor Kendrick. Philadelphians were electrified. The police winked at each other, convinced that Butler was just a smart grandstander who would make a big splash for the headlines, then quiet down and take it easy. Senator Vere would see to that. Nevertheless, he was showing results. Worried Philadelphia bootleggers began unloading their stocks at cut prices. Many crooks and gamblers began streaming out of the city in search of more hospitable territory. Encouraging excessive zeal among his forces, General Butler took responsibility for police who went too far on these raids by using axes freely to destroy furniture and fixtures, searching private homes and vehicles on suspicion, and closing premises that had a right to stay open to sell non-intoxicating beverages. Magistrates began refusing to issue search warrants to permit police to enter known speakeasies masquerading as private residences. Many cases were dismissed on grounds of insufficient or illegal evidence. General Butler realized that he would have to modify his tactics and astonished Philadelphians by frankly confessing his mistakes to both the press and the police. Such candor won the affection and respect of reporters who found Butler colorful copy and loved to join him for midnight suppers on Chestnut Street. There was never any question he would not answer for them directly and honestly. But if they were for him, their publishers, with the exception of the Philadelphia Record, were not. Their editorial pages sought to ridicule and discredit him relentlessly. Quote, "They insisted on treating me like a queer animal from the circus," Butler related. "My chance remarks were twisted and distorted to paint me in the worst light." By March, angry Republican ward leaders were furious at Butler for disrupting their network of police control. They vigorously applauded City Treasurer Thomas J. Watson at a meeting when he shouted, quote, "This country, as well as the Republican organization, would be a hell of a sight better off without Butler." The Philadelphia City Council closed ranks against him. Quote, "My foolish notion that the laws of our country applied to rich and poor alike accounted for the growing feeling of antipathy towards me," he recalled later, adding, "By the end of 1924, I had been cussed, discussed, boycotted, lied about, lied to, strung up, and reviled. Several times I was on the point of resigning. The only reason why I continued in my unpopular and uncomfortable position was to see what the hell was going to happen next." Try as he might, he was unable to break the power of the ward bosses. In April, he was forced to admit that he had been double-crossed by about half of his police lieutenants, who had bowed to ward boss pressure to permit shuttered saloons, gambling houses, and speakeasies to reopen. Studying the structure, General Butler found that every ward had one police station. The ward leader named the captain of the station, and the police thus belonged to the ward leader. In an attempt to destroy the power of the ward bosses, Butler now cut the stations down from 46 to 33. Infuriated politicians, racketeers, and realtors who hated him for having cost them the rents of 1,500 closed brothels, as well as the income from other illegally operated properties, joined forces to demand that Mayor Kendrick fire him. But nearly 5,000 church congregations adopted resolutions in July demanding that the mayor give full support to General Butler. Added to this pressure were thousands of letters from women's clubs, civic groups, business organizations, and individuals. Mayor Kendrick, alarmed at being caught between the voters and the brokers of power, wavered back and forth. A mass meeting of 4,000 Philadelphians resolved that General Butler must be kept in office. Quote, "Since General Butler has been in command here, More has been accomplished for the suppression of vice and crime than in any period of like duration in this city. They flooded Secretary of the Navy Curtis Wilbur with letters urging that Butler's leave of absence from the Marines be extended for another 3 years. President Calvin Coolidge reluctantly agreed to extend the general's leave for 1 more year, but he pointed out to the citizens of Philadelphia that the federal government could not continue indefinitely to be responsible for solutions to local problems. Quote, "The practice of detailing officers of the United States military forces to serve in civil capacities in the different states on leaves of absence is of doubtful propriety and should be employed only in cases of emergency. Local self-government cannot be furnished from the outside." Now reappointed, by the end of the year, Butler had raided about 4,000 speakeasies, shutting down 2,566, and had seized over 1,000 whiskey stills, arresting 10,000 violators of the Volstead Act. But to his dismay, political pressure in the court system resulted in only 2,000 indictments by the grand jury, with only 300 convictions. Police magistrates, who were handpicked by the politicians, imposed only token fines on all but 4% of arrested speakeasy operators. Struggling to get honest law enforcement, Butler complained to the press, was like submitting to Chinese water torture. "Drops of water have been dripping on my head since I have been here," General Butler wrote. "Either I am unpopular or the enforcement of the liquor laws is unpopular in this city. When the people of Philadelphia or any other city stop playing the game of enforce the law against others but not against me, they will begin to win the fight against lawlessness." He was bitter when he learned of a secret deal between the brewers of Philadelphia and the Republican State Campaign Committee. A royalty of $2 for each barrel of illegal beer distributed was to be paid into the Republican campaign fund, provided the politicians put the White House under heavy pressure to recall General Butler to his duty with the Marines. Towards the end of 1925, whether this deal was responsible or not, President Coolidge did refuse to extend Butler's leave any longer. The general was ordered to report after the first of the year to command the Marine post at San Diego. Meanwhile, General Butler had become increasingly irked by the fact that the pressure of powerful hotels and the Hotel Association had kept their ballroom social affairs, at which liquor was served to young teenage girls from socially prominent Philadelphia families, from being raided for liquor violations. Ordering a raid on a formal ball at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, he seized evidence showing that bootleg liquor was being served. Confronting Mayor Kendrick, he demanded that the mayor institute padlock proceedings against the Ritz-Carlton. "And I mean the whole hotel," he insisted. "Something must be done to teach these big fellows that they must obey the law as well as the little fellows." A howl of outrage was heard in the ranks of the Republican Party's wealthiest members. Politicians were threatened with a wholesale withdrawal of campaign contributions unless General Butler was now unceremoniously dumped. Greatly upset, Mayor Kendrick urged Butler to lay off the big hotels. To the mayor's horror, Butler firmly announced his intention to organize a special police squad in evening clothes to invade all Philadelphia hotels and signal for raids whenever they found liquor law violations. His fighting spirit was now thoroughly aroused. Although he longed to get back to his beloved Marine Corps, it rankled him to leave a mission incomplete. Although he longed to get back to his beloved Marine Corps, it rankled him to leave a mission incomplete. If he left Philadelphia now, he would have enforced the law against small operators who bootleg liquor to the poor, but not against the big operators who made it available to the rich. His egalitarian nature pressed him to balance the scales. He also felt an obligation to the honest cops who had defied the ward bosses to support his fight against corruption. Once he was gone, he feared they would be punished for their loyalty to him. He decided that he owed it to them to sacrifice his career in the Marine Corps to stay on and finish the job, especially since Mayor Kendrick had made it clear, or so Butler believed, that he needed and wanted him there. The morning papers carried the story that Butler was resigning from the Marine Corps to remain as director of public safety. Appalled, the hotel owners of the city joined with local politicians in a demand that Mayor Kendrick just fire Butler immediately. The mayor was reminded that the Hotel Association's cooperation with City Hall was absolutely essential for the excess of a sesquicentennial celebration of American independence being planned for Philadelphia. Worried and upset, Mayor Kendrick called Butler to his office and told him, "I don't want any resigned generals around me. You ought to go back to the service where you belong. Even the president doesn't want you here." Shocked at the mayor's spineless surrender, Butler stalked out, storming, "Oh, hell, I can't talk to such a weak fish." Kendrick then fired him by phone. In choice Marine language, Butler told Kendrick exactly what he thought of him. Clearing the desk, the general withdrew a blue steel Army Colt 45 and inserted it in a holster engraved, "To General Smedley D. Butler from W. Freeland Kendrick." "Give him this letter of resignation and the pistol," he told his aide. "He can publish the letter and he can do what he pleases with the gun. I'm going back to the troops." His letter of resignation declared, quote, "Last week, I decided that it was in keeping with my promise to the police of Philadelphia that if they stood up with me, I would do everything in my power to remain in Philadelphia. I am being dismissed from public service because I am making the greatest sacrifice any Marine can make, and I should, without any other ties, be of more service to the city of Philadelphia than I was before." He had been fired, he charged, because, quote, "the gang that has ruled Philadelphia for many years had been out to get him, and they did." The Philadelphia Record, which had consistently supported Butler during his 2 years as the city's super cop, declared, quote, "He was honest. That was taken for granted, or he would not have been appointed. But he was 100% honest. We think we are doing the mayor no injustice in expressing the belief that this was little more than he had counted on." Later reviewing his experience in Philadelphia, General Butler declared ironically, quote, "The fact the mayor didn't know me led to my being chosen. The fact that I didn't know the mayor led me to accept. I had a funny idea that law was applicable to everybody. I was a fool. I didn't get anywhere except for getting a lot of money as the highest paid cop in America, $18,000. Had the kids educated, lost 35 pounds and my teeth, bought a car, and ended up $300 in debt. What Philadelphia really wanted was something to talk about, a real, live general. No other city had one as a cop. They wanted to throw up a smokescreen and make people think Philadelphia had thrown off the yoke of crime." Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who visited Butler in Philadelphia to study his cleanup, wrote about it in her biography. She wrote, quote, "He did a fine job. He replaced the old roundsman, fat and portly, with young and active men, and then he put them into something of the Marine esprit de corps. He put the fear of God into the gamblers and the dive keepers. He cut down the enormous graft which they had paid year after year. But they were only waiting. They could afford to wait. When Butler lost the front page, they would come back. I watched Butler and admired him. The same sheer ability, energy, and knowledge of men which had succeeded at Brest were evident in all that he did. But it was an unbeatable game, that of the crooks, gamblers, bootleggers, and dive keepers." On the eve of his departure, the Philadelphia Record reporter Paul Comley French and other newsmen who admired his honesty and courage gave Butler an informal midnight dinner. They presented him with a square silver token, explaining, "It's the only kind of money he'll accept, square." "Cleaning up Philadelphia's vice," he told them with a sigh, "is worse than any battle I was ever in." And of course, that same reporter and that same newspaper, the Philadelphia Record, would later be the newspaper who in 1933-34, General Butler went to blow the whistle about the plot to seize the White House. Brooding over the whole question of prohibition and law enforcement, General Butler began to suspect that perhaps he had been wrong in trying to enforce an unenforceable law that the majority of the American people did not seem to want and went out of their way to violate. The government was wrong, he finally decided, in trying to legislate morality. In view of his fame, though, as a stern enforcer of prohibition, prudence suggested that he keep his changed views to himself. He was already unpopular enough with the wets. To speak out now against the Volstead Act would only alienate millions of drys who considered him one of their knights in white armor. But popularity had never been as important to Smedley Butler as his compulsion to blurt out the truth in public and to kick sacred cows in the rump when they loitered in the path of justice. On January 7th, 1927, in Washington, D.C., he gave the reporters a story that flashed from coast to coast. The Volstead Act, he now declared, was, quote, a fool-dry act, impossible of enforcement. It was, furthermore, class legislation because the rich could avoid it and the poor could not. This sensational denunciation of prohibition by one of its leading Republican crusaders plunged the dry forces of the nation into consternation. Democrats, rejoicing, began laying plans to make repeal of the Volstead Act one of the key issues in the presidential campaign of 1928. At this point in his life, General Butler seemed to be grappling with a lot of his former beliefs. You know, he'd been a lifelong Republican, a great enforcer of prohibition, and through doing that job, he came to realize that this law is deeply flawed and the people just don't want it. It's unworkable, it's unenforceable, and he changed his mind. And you know, after he left Philadelphia as the director of public safety, of course, he went back to the Marines and was then sent on a long assignment once again in China to protect the interests of Standard Oil. And it was during that campaign in China that Butler's views began to change yet again. So prohibition wasn't the only issue he was grappling with. He was also, this great Marine general, also coming to terms with and changing his mind about the very subject of war itself. And so that's where we're going to dive back in on page 110. He's back in Philadelphia now, back from China. It is now 1931. And I think this little excerpt is so interesting because it really gives us a look inside the metamorphosis of General Smedley Butler. Now resolutely opposed to military intervention overseas on behalf of Wall Street interests, General Butler planned to arouse the American people into preventing any more. At the same time, though, he still had doubts about the wisdom of entering world disarmament agreements, as leading pacifists were proposing. Could the United States afford to disarm and trust the word of military dictators like Italy's Mussolini, with Hitler's swiftly growing Nazi party in Germany already laying the groundwork for a new war by renouncing the Versailles Treaty? In a speech before the influential Contemporary Club of Philadelphia on January 19, 1931, he declared, quote, I agree with Dr. Hall of Swarthmore College. If we could all lay down our arms, there couldn't be any war. But there are mad dog nations who won't get the word, who will refuse to sign the agreement, or if they sign it, refuse to abide by it. Seeking to impress his listeners with the kind of men dictators really were, he added, quote, a friend of mine said he had a ride in a new automobile with Mussolini, a car with an armored nose that could knock over fences and slip under barbed wire. He said that they drove through the country and towns at 75 miles per hour. They ran over a child, and my friend screamed. Mussolini said he shouldn't do that, that it was only one life, and the affairs of the state could not be stopped by one life. His listeners gasped audibly. Arms akimbo, his head thrust forward angrily, General Butler demanded in a scornful voice, "How can you talk disarmament with a man like that?" He had been told that the audience was a private one and that he could speak in confidence, but he soon learned that there was no such thing as confidential speech for a man so often in the public eye. Among his listeners, unknown to him, was an Italian diplomat from Washington who had been invited to attend. The outraged diplomat at once reported Butler's remarks to Italian Ambassador Di Martino. The embassy sent a frantic cable to Rome, then filed an official protest with the State Department. The morning papers broke the story, and it made sensational headlines. A high-ranking American officer wearing the Marine uniform on active duty had publicly insulted the head of what was then a friendly power to the United States. Secretary of State Henry Stimson felt compelled to deliver a formal apology to Mussolini. Quote, "The sincere regrets of this government are extended to Mr. Mussolini and to the Italian people for the discourteous and unwarranted utterances by a commissioned officer of this government on active duty." The Washington military diplomatic bureaucracy now decided that this time Butler had gone too far. Formal charges against him were hastily drawn up and presented to President Herbert Hoover, who promptly signed them. On the morning of January 29th, Marine Commandant Ben Fuller phoned Butler at Quantico. "General Butler, you are hereby placed under arrest to wait trial by General Court-Martial. You will turn over your command to your next senior, General Berkeley, and you will be restricted to the limits of your post. The Secretary of the Navy wishes you to know that this action is taken by the direct personal order of the President of the United States." The charges were, quote, "conduct to the prejudice of good order and discipline," and "conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman." These accusations were known in the armed forces as Mother Hubbard charges because they covered everything. Most Marine officers were convinced that the powers that be had decided to throw the book at General Butler and drum him out of the Corps dishonorably in revenge for his well-known fighting man's scorn of Washington's desk warriors. Butler notified Brigadier General Randolph C. Berkeley, his junior officer at Quantico and a good friend, that he was under arrest, the first general officer to be placed under arrest since the Civil War. Butler's two-star command flag was lowered on the Quantico flagstaff, and he offered his sword to Berkeley, who indignantly refused to accept it. Berkeley was outraged that Smedley Butler, who wore 18 decorations and was one of only 4 military men in American history who had ever been awarded 2 Medals of Honor, should be put under arrest by a telephone call. He was even more indignant that Butler had been confined to the post, hindering his ability to arrange for his own defense at the court-martial. Chapter 19. News of his arrest brought an outpouring of sympathy and support for him, not only among his far-flung and influential staunch friends, but also among millions of Americans who despised Mussolini and everything the dictator stood for. Admiring Butler for speaking out against fascism, they were appalled that he was being court-martialed for being a patriot who believed in democracy, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and distrusted dictators who denied such civil liberties to their own people. Butler also had the support of millions of veterans who knew him as a magnificent fighting man and hero, as well as a general who was on the side of the enlisted man against the brass, and the hundreds of thousands of admirers who still remembered the courageous fight he had waged against the crooked politicians and the racketeers of Philadelphia. Many Americans, moreover, were fed up with the Hoover administration for sitting on its hands with the Depression rapidly worsening, and esteemed a public leader who at least had the courage of his convictions and spoke them bluntly. Italian-American anti-fascists also rallied to Butler's support by bitter protests against Stimson's apology to Mussolini. The administration grew alarmed as a rolling tidal wave of angry criticism of Butler's arrest swept across the country. "Unless we are mistaken," declared a Washington Daily News editorial, The American people are likely to consider these cabinet officials guilty of a strange timidity towards Mussolini on the one hand, and of an unwarranted harshness towards a splendid American soldier on the other. Butler wired New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had presented him with one of his medals of honor back when he was Undersecretary of the Navy. "Am in great trouble. Can you assist me in securing the services of John W. Davis as counsel?" Davis, a leading Wall Street corporation lawyer, had been the unsuccessful Democratic candidate for president back in 1924. Roosevelt, in fact, persuaded Davis to agree to argue Butler's case at trial. A visit to Butler's aunt, lawyer Isabel Darlington, also enlisted Roland S. Morris, former ambassador to Japan, as Henry Leonard's counsel in preparing the case. Thousands of sympathetic messages poured into Quantico. Butler was deeply touched by two letters especially. Both Governor Roosevelt and former Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels volunteered to testify on his behalf at the court-martial. That news stunned Adams and President Hoover. The impending trial was also throwing a spanner into Secretary of State Stimson's plans for forging an international naval arms limitation agreement. Crucial to that agreement were preliminary negotiations between Italy and France, which feared Italian and German fascism. Resisting Stimson's pressure to sign an arms limitation agreement with Mussolini, the French cited as justification popular American support of General Butler's view that Mussolini could not be trusted, and widespread protest over his arrest for saying so. Mussolini himself, alarmed by the bad press he was getting in the United States, with a few notorious exceptions, sent word to Stimson that he considered the whole incident, quote, an unfortunate error, and believed it would be best for all concerned if the whole plan to court-martial Butler could be quietly dropped. Secretary Stimson, who now realized that he had a tiger by the tail, passed the word to the crestfallen Adams. The Secretary of the Navy now had to beat a hasty retreat with as much dignity as he could muster out of his humiliating predicament. He sent Leonard a letter announcing his decision to settle the matter by calling off the court-martial and simply detaching Butler from his command with a reprimand, placing him on the inactive list with the limbo status of awaiting orders. In polite language, Leonard told Adams to go to hell. A few hours later, after checking with his principals, the Secretary of the Navy then offered to let the whole thing drop by just detaching Butler from the command and issuing a reprimand. Again, Leonard turned him down flatly. Adams frantically tried a third proposal. The administration would settle, he now pleaded, for an official letter of apology. There would be no court-martial and no removal of Butler from Quantico. Roaring a third refusal, Leonard demanded that Adams stop dawdling and proceed to trial. By now, the administration, in a state of near panic, meekly asked Leonard just what terms for settling the matter would be acceptable to General Butler. Leonard, jubilant at this abject surrender, conferred with Morris and General Butler. Angry at his persecutors, Butler wanted to insist upon the court-martial, but as he confided to a relative on February 12th, quote, Mother and Bunny, his wife, were both breaking under the strain, and he decided that it wasn't worth their anguish to fight the establishment to a finish. I feel we could have licked them badly, he added, but now I have a club over their heads, as they were warned that we would tell if they tried any more persecutions. Since he had already won a clear moral victory, he decided he could let the government save a little face. He agreed to write a letter reiterating his explanation that the Mussolini speech had been made at a private club meeting, and expressed regret that anything he'd said had, quote, caused embarrassment to the government. He would accept an official gentle reprimand, which was, however, not to be written by Adams, but by his lawyer, Leonard himself, for Adams to sign. In return for these concessions, the government would announce that it was dropping its court-martial and was immediately restoring the general to his command with full rank and privileges, without prejudice of any kind. The administration hastily accepted Butler's terms, and the suitable papers were drawn up. On February 9th, the court-martial was canceled, and a mild reprimand credited Butler's explanation that his speech had been intended to be confined to the limits of 4 walls, as well as acknowledging his long record of brilliant service. The general's admirers grinned in delight. He was released from arrest and restored to duty, his command flag once more fluttering over Quantico. It was a signal and a remarkable victory for a lone Marine officer to win over the President of the United States and the Secretaries of State and the Navy. The press was reluctant to let the story die. The wire services carried journalist Cornelius Vanderbilt's revelation that he had been the one who had told Butler the true story about Mussolini. He corrected a few details. After running down the child, Vanderbilt said, Mussolini had observed the journalist looking back in horror and had patted his knee reassuringly, saying, "Never look back, Mr. Vanderbilt. Always look ahead in life." Italian officials now were scrambling to deny that Vanderbilt had ever ridden in a car with Mussolini. Butler was appalled, but not too surprised, to read that Ralph T. O'Neill, national commander of the American Legion, had presented to Italian Ambassador DiMartino a resolution in praise of Mussolini, passed by the National Executive Committee. There were powerful and influential wealthy elements in the Legion leadership who admired Mussolini's shackling of Italian labor unions under the guise of fighting Reds. Now that he had defeated the attempt of his enemies to court-martial him, Butler revealed to his friends that he intended to go ahead with his original plan to retire at the end of the year. But then on March 1st, he informed the press, barking, "Get this clear, I am not resigning." And I think I'll leave it there at the opening of chapter 20. We'll pick up there in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this. Man, what a story. What a colorful man General Butler was. Pretty amazing character. And I hope that if you're just now getting to know him, I hope you're getting a good chuckle out of all this. Even though it's a deeply serious subject, there's just so many good laughs in here too. And thankfully, we can all laugh about it now because it never happened. In the end, the coup was not successful, thank God. So, folks, I will see you back here for the next episode, episode 4, of The Plot to Seize the White House, the shocking true story of the conspiracy to overthrow FDR by Jules Archer.